I'm really excited to introduce our speaker this evening, who has absolutely not disappointed in her presence. So thank you so much for being with us. Author and LGBTQ historian Tyne O'Connell. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I've not been out of bed since the 7th of October, so I'm a little bit sort of struck by the real world.
Well, we greatly appreciate it. And, since the 7th of October, to have us as your first event is very kind. And we're so grateful to have you. And to get us started, tell us a little bit about your own background, because your history itself is incredibly interesting.
Yes, I've had an interesting upbringing, I suppose. My father was a spy, and my mother was an academic, and I went to an extraordinary array of schools, but mostly I was educated in a convent by nonagenarian and older nuns who'd been through 3 wars and had very unique ideas on how to. My mother always had a more Victorian upbringing than her. But for example, when we studied history, everything seemed to be history with nuns who were in their 90s and older. They would write in chalk. They're all about 4 foot tall. They would write in chalk on the board, say Einstein. And then they put in brackets next to it, or a woman close to him. They were very dubious about the abilities and trustworthiness of men generally. And when you remember that they'd been through 3 world wars and taken in refugees and harboured little Jewish children in the Second World War and defended them in Belgium and defended themselves at what is now Belgium and Flanders, defended themselves in their charges against Nazi intruders. And they actually cut my father out of, when he flew in a plane of always the latest Spitfires. They could fly higher and faster than any other planes, any German planes. But he didn't carry guns, carry cameras, and he would land, do soft landings in enemy territories and do all sorts of extraordinary things. But one of the things that happened to him in his time during the war was he was cut out, he fell from the sky, his plane he came too low taking photographs. He might have been making a soft landing and he was shot down, someone spotted him, he thought he was safe and someone shot him down. As he came down and was landing in this field in the middle of nowhere, he thought these nuns came running at him from a circular arrangement with large tailor scissors in their hands to cut him out with the parachute. He thought, God, what's going to happen to me? But he thought they was Nazi agents, Nazi hit force, 4 foot tall nuns. But they cut him out because the children, their clothes were sort of shredded off them by that point. They made clothes up from the silk of his parachute. And that's how he came to meet Quentin Crisp, not being shot out of the sky over Flanders, but going to a white-tied ball at Buckingham Palace in the war. The bombs were falling in Mayfair. And
just put the microphone just slightly there, that's better.
The bombs were falling, and my father was dashing in white tie, and he saw a direct hit on a house, and in the distance, and as he approached, there was a man in a 3-piece suit and bare feet, clambering over it. This is about 8 in the evening, clambering over what was left of the building, rescuing the little with a child in one hand and a painting on the other, he said. And then he was grabbed by this American GI. Sorry, not an American GI grabbed him around the neck like he was Mother Teresa and begged him to take him to a shelter. My father's in white tie with this GI clinging to him. Bombs going off everywhere. And he's got one idea in mind, and that is to get to a ball, to dance with pretty girls and, have some fun. And he can't get this fellow's limp weight around his neck. And he said, I'll take you, but the fellow was so full of fear, he was beyond reaching. And Quentin saved the day. He came and was very happy to assist him to carry what my father later realised was a very attractive young GI to safety. And so the two of them managed to get this frightened GI to the Green Park into the underground. And when he realised my father wasn't going down under, he said, you know, you saved my life, buddy, and it forced this knife his father had made from as a child on him. And my father said, no, I'm not coming down there, you know, I'm going to a party. And Quentin assured him he would take care of the boy. And so my father didn't expect to see Quentin or the GI ever again, but the next morning he turned up at Hayward bookshop, Nancy Mitford's bookshop, and there was Quentin pouring the kettle, making tea, because Nancy hadn't arrived, her house had been hit. And so, you know, she always left everyone left their doors open, apparently. So that was how the beginning of useful friendship. And I'm autistic, and he was a key figure in my life. And he was the person who impressed on me the need to write about queer history. And with the queer upbringing I'd had with the nuns, demanding at every turn that I question history, that I don't question what I was being told, that I question everything and everyone, that every piece of knowledge I was given, that I questioned its veracity. It was a perfect sort of, it was an epiphany. And so I continued my search for history in the British archives. This is when I was very young. And in the British Library, I would pull up archives in Oxford, and then I would write away to people, and I would meet people, and they would connect me to people. And through source archives, I began to understand that history is, as Balzac said when he wrote his own tissue of lies, history is written by privileged liars. And he was one such privileged liar himself. He wrote the history of the three Medici queens, Queen Catherine Medici, Queen Marguerite Medici, Queen Marie de Medici, the greatest Medici of them all, for it is she who triggered the age of the diva, which is where I really think that history gets exciting for LGBTQ torchbearers. Although we, remember that throughout history it has always been considered, up until 1850, completely natural to be trans, to be gay. There was never any question that it was natural, that they believed that gender could be changed after birth. Remember, the word gender was interchangeable, sex was sex. And hence a lot of double entendres and funny plays were made in Greek and Latin and English. So, given that you could change your gender after birth, this is explained through, in fact, gender realignment surgeons that I know told me that we are increasingly moving towards Galland's way of thinking about gender, which is fascinating in itself. So the way he was a 3rd century Greek, he lived in what was then the part of the Greek Roman Empire, but it was anyhow. So he was a 3rd century Latin physician, and he wrote Galland's Humours, which described gender as a spectrum. Humours, the 4 humours. So we have the wet, cold humours is a completely female woman, and hot, dry humours are a completely masculine man. But most people are to be found on different areas of this spectrum. This was Galland's thinking, and indeed the thinking of all physicians, because it was the primary text for all physicians up until 1849. After which, I mean, I'm not saying that physicians didn't continue to read him in the 13th, but it ceased to be a primary text, and people were questioning the humours quite scientifically. But the four humours enabled gender to be changed by actions and substances and manipulation. It was believed that people were born with heart. Oh, I'm having my hair
I think we might be just making sure a plant doesn't get knocked off in the process.
That's the first time I've done my feathers myself.
They look unbelievable.
Oh, thank you. So Galland's humours created this sense where we felt that it was natural to be gay or trans and queer anywhere on the spectrum you might be. Now, religious authorities might have had different ideas about it, but we have the famous 3rd century emperor. I've forgotten his. Sorry. Yes, Elagabalus. She rather, because she insisted on being called her ladyship and dressed as a lady, and she was a very controversial emperor, but not because she was trans. She offered her all her riches to the physician who could provide her with a vagina. So she was very controversial, but not because of her transgenderism, but because of her attempts to usurp Jupiter for the god of Elagabalus. So that didn't go over too well. But where I find myself becoming completely overwhelmed by the importance of LGBTQ torchbearers is the age of the diva, the Baroque, as it's also known. Marie de Medici was a cross-dressing young girl and woman. Now, she used to escape as a teenager from the walls of the Pretty Palace, and with her maid, she would go to the taverns of the Bohemians, the artists and artisans, and she heard a new form of music, women for the first time singing in public. And this was what opera was. We didn't have men in opera until the 18th century and 19th centuries. Operas were solely to showcase the female singing voice for the first time in history. It was only for one's husband that one's voice belonged. To expose it to the public was obscene. So this was truly sensational. And when she was told she was to marry Henry the Fourth of France, Henry the Great, the first Bourbon king, to unite all of France, she said, well, I will have my wedding reception will be an opera. And she took one of the lead parts. And for the first time in history, women were taking the lead. And many of these women were queer. They were not that was controversial. Sapphism has never been illegal in Britain. It's never been particularly, unless you made a spectacle of it, it was never something that the authorities or the public religious groups might feel differently. But in terms of legislation, we have been free, but not so for gay men. Gay men, the first legislation to appear in Britain against homosexuality was with the Reformation, 1533, Henry VIII, under the rather forceful proddings of Wolsey, introduced the Buggery Act, which is self-explanatory. And it wasn't celebrating buggery, I'll leave it at that. And very harsh penalties that really seem quite shocking compared to the punishment for transgender individuals. The first transgender that legislation, 1533. Then Mary, the Catholic Queen, because Catholics, of course, believe in conscience rather than biblical text, and Christ himself had a relationship, it said, with John. So Catholics have never wanted to engage too thoroughly. Well, a few popes have, but mostly they've wanted to tread gingerly in that area because it's a minefield for Catholics. But just to say that Mary legalized it. She struck the Buggery Act off the books, and it was free once again to be, it was able that gay men were once again able to openly live their lives in truth. But
So 20 years the Buggery Act lasted before being struck off, and most people hadn't noticed it. If it wasn't for Elizabeth I putting it firmly back into legislation in 1559, then it probably would never have been reintroduced. Who's to know? Anyway, she did, and that was because the Puritans were, thanks to print media, the growth of printing presses in Britain, are gaining in power. The Puritans, remember, we talk a lot about Puritans and puritanical thinking, but the Puritans did not call themselves Puritans. That was an insult that meant just a derogatory term for someone who was a hypocrite, had a fondness for quoting from biblical text and pointing the finger at other people whilst, as I said, being a hypocrite. So Puritans called themselves the godly, or the Congregationists. They belonged to a variety of faiths who mostly were known as the Congregation of the Firstborn, and they all had different interpretations of the Bible. And they gained a lot of power because they belonged to the gentry. Only 4% of them, remember. And as I said, they seem to wield a lot of power. We ultimately end up having a religious civil war in 1642 due to the Puritans and their ability to express themselves in print media. Funded, basically. They had their own Fleet Street. We had Fleet Street, that is ordinary folk who had liberal thoughts. And in the city of London, they had their own street, which is Watling Street, I think. Anyhow, the Edgware Road, the Great North Road in the city of London. And they printed an enormous amount of material in very ordinary English. And also it's important to keep in mind that in the 1600s, an era I love so much, as I said, because of the extreme numbers of LGBTQ torchbearers that emerge, that have been ghosted, maligned, or heteronormalized from history by Victorian historians. And this is all to do with the increasing number of Puritans in the country. But already we see at that point them expressing a lot of power, imposing a lot of power over Queen Elizabeth, whose main achievement was to unify the country under the Anglican faith. She did that by making it a mixture of Catholicism and the Protestant faiths. So you could believe in transubstantiation or not, you could believe in Our Lady or not. It was all up to you. All you had to acknowledge was that the Queen, the monarch, was the head of the church. The Pope is the enemy of the state. And it was as simple as that, really. And most people were happy to go along with it. They still had the bells, the smells, the nice singing. But so singing again, let's get back to the age of the diva and opera. So opera hits the stage in a big way because Queen Marie in Florence, with her wedding, invited 4,000 of the greatest and most important influencers of the age. Now, I used the word influencer deliberately because instead of inviting the usual good and the great, the usual suspects, the envoys, the ambassadors, the kings and the queens and the leading aristocrats, she invited influencers, important people who had the power to create opinions, because this was a new phenomena then. We have social media now, but print media then was on another level. They were printing, pamphlets were being printed around the clock. By 1625, it's estimated that 1 in 4 people and more in London had 1 in 4 households had a printing press. And they were using these presses with gay abandon to fill the world, fill the cities, towns, and villages with information about the arts, about how to please your lover, recipes, diaries of a gentlewoman, inside the Queen's closet, all number of issues were being discussed. Fighting matches, betting scores, information and false information. It was just like today on Twitter. And you couldn't walk down any street of London or any town or village without having a pamphlet shoved in your hand. Pamphlets could be 1,000 pages long. So you'd get a page one day, the next day, another page, so it would go on. So we've got one of the most famous pamphlets that we have circulating, that we still have today, is Anglo-Saxonism, which talks about not only morality issues and the superiority of heterosexuality, but the superior race, the supreme race, the closest to God in the great chain of being, a topic the Puritans loved. And they used morality to justify all sorts of immoral impositions on people's lives. So morality, and their basis for this was their made-up Bibles, as I said. So Elizabeth, we can say, oh, she was a terrible hypocrite, but was she? She imposed this law to the proclamation of apparel, it was called. It was to ban cross-dressing, but it did so much more than that, because cross-dressing was used for self-expression, and sumptuary laws were one of the few laws that were enforced by what we would now think of as a police force. They were imposed by sheriffs, sumptuary laws, so that if you wore a ruff that was larger than the ruff you're entitled to wear, based on your profession or blood, then you would be put in the stocks or beaten or even imprisoned. And they walked around the fashion police with rulers so that they could measure ruffs and measure heels. And so makeup and all these things were legislated against in 1574 so vigorously that people were being beaten for dressing as women when they were women, just manly looking women. It was mad. It was a really nutty time. So when our first openly gay king, after Elizabeth dies, the next monarch we have is King James I, who was openly gay. In fact, he was kidnapped by the Scottish lairds and held for 9 months at Rothaven Castle until he would denounce his lover, his gay lover. He refused to do this, and eventually his lover, the Duke of Lennox, Esme Stuart, took himself back to Paris, where he died a few months later and sent his heart back to James. James was buried with it. It was not unusual, remember then, to send people body parts.
Remember that when you're listening.
My own great, a couple of greats back, Daniel O'Connell, whom I'm direct descendant of, when he died, supposedly his dying words were, "My heart to Rome, my body to Ireland." And Esme said, "My heart to James and my body to Paris." So we can stay here. So these hearts were put in monstrances. Sometimes people sent their brains as well. They did this up until the end of the 1800s. So it wasn't that larky or eccentric as you might think. It wasn't eccentric at all, let's face it. People had much broader, more tolerant. They had a broader idea of how people should live a life. There was not so much finger pointing, was very much something that the Puritans introduced. And as I said, there were 4% up until the 1620s, which were very much like the 1920s in the sense that they're an age of the roaring girls, they called them. These were women who chose, some of them cross-dressed, but they were women who were defiant, who were refusing to live as women supposedly should. They were sometimes, as I said, cross-dressing, sometimes they weren't. And Frith's muse, Frith, was called one of these roaring girls. Frith, in fact, was the first trans actor, the first openly transgender figure we have in history to actively work to legalize and gain acceptance for trans community. When Cromwell came to power, he banned cross-dressing. He also banned people living as men or women if they wasn't their birth gender. And again, as I said, people would be punished for it without a physical inspection, which sometimes they were too hasty to get a beating in or a punishment in. Without a physical inspection, it wasn't always clear. But Mal was the first person, stood on stage in the Fortune Theatre in London in 1605 and said that extemporized on stage after a play called The Roaring Girl, which was about his life and about how he wasn't all the things the Puritans said he was. He was not a criminal. He wasn't this. He wasn't that. That he was. But he said, you see before you a man. But if you come home with me and watch me undress, you'd find that isn't entirely true. Now we first come across Mal Frith in the As You Like It, the Shakespearean play, which was it was banned by Elizabeth, stayed. If you look at the archives, almost all of Shakespeare's plays that were written in the Elizabethan era weren't staged until the Jacobean, which is when he gained fame. He spent the 90s in prison, and he didn't come to London until the 1590s. He had mostly his historical plays produced. And Elizabeth, there's no evidence she ever saw a play, despite what people like to dream up. There's no archival evidence that she ever saw a play. She certainly had no interest in theatre. She loved bear baiting. But anyway, Shakespeare performed As You Like It in polar bear baiting, which sounds especially ghastly. She liked the way the blood contrasted with the white of the bear's fur. But so here we are. We've got a gay king. He's traveling down from Edinburgh to London in the gayest style, with 2,000 white horses with white feather plumage, and carriages of beautiful men. And he holds up at Wilton House for the best part of the year before his coronation. So as soon as he hears that Elizabeth's dead on the 24th of March, the Queen is dead, long live the Queen, the cry went up. All the newspapers held this, bore the headline, and everyone in the chronicles of John Howe, about 1603, which were published in 1605, he describes swarms of people running across fields and over hedges, crying out, "The Queen is dead! Long live Queen James!" as his procession approached. And this followed him all the way down to Wilton House near Salisbury, where he held up with Mary Herbert, another one of these wonderfully fascinating cross-dressing women who had sapphic tendencies. Again, as I said, that was not controversial. She hosted a salon, the most famous salon, which became the template for salons and up until the Bloomsbury salon. They were called circles in Britain, and they were unlike any salons in Europe because she dissolved. They were hosted by defiant women and attended by LGBTQ and men and women. And they dissolved the barriers of class, of race, of religion, the most controversial, gender. All barriers were dissolved. All that mattered was new ideas and new art forms. And this is especially compelling because all the new ideas, Francis Bacon, another great gay torchbearer of history, was a regular attender of her salon and was there to greet the king when he arrived. And the king ennobled him to Lord Burleigh, and he became a fascinating figure of the Jacobean, the age of the diva. He slotted right in. It was an age made for him.
And I just wanted to kind of ask about, because I think one of the things that you comment on hugely is the word eccentric. You're very proudly, I think you were awarded once Eccentric of the Year by Prince Philip.
Medal.
And eccentric was this word that was kind of the original word, right, that was used to describe people who were, I suppose, different, people who were, living in their own identity, who were being themselves, but, were, going outside of the bonds of what was, expected of society.
As I said, it was a much more liberal world then. Once James came to power, the sumptuary laws were abolished, And people went, for the first time in history, people could express themselves through what they wore. Now, before that, you were just a representative of your class. You didn't have an identity. You were a glove maker, a shoemaker, a cobbler, or a cordwainer if you made fine bespoke footwear, a jeweler, a clerk, a solicitor, or a member of the aristocracy, or a member of the royal court, a gentleman or a lady. The point is you were not an individual. You were just a member of your class. The closer you got to the top of society, the more room you had to express yourself as an individual, but it was still strictly codified by what you wore. Now, James abolished those laws in 1604. It was the first thing he did. And this is very significant because it meant that it was okay to be trans. And this is what created this society, which is so commented on by visiting ambassadors, envoys, and merchants from Europe, Africa, and Asia, who all came here because we became such an open, tolerant society. We became the hub of the Baroque. All the opera singers came here because the money awarded them was so much greater than anywhere else. And James did something that was also very important to British power. Remember, at this point, we were the bankrupted, carbuncle, really, nation on the edge of Europe.
Can't imagine how that feels.
We were broke. We'd been suffering famines for over 20 years because we'd been at war with all the four major powers of Europe. Spain, Portugal, France, and Holland. All of them, Elizabeth waged and lost wars with all of them. So despite the fact that she created great propaganda, I think, she had the greatest propagandist working for her. Both the Cecils, both Robert and William Cecil, his son, they were just a pair of magic story weavers, great fiction. The Armada was a complete fiction and a complete disaster. But the point of it is that we were poor. People had suffered. They were hungry. Everyone was hungry. Other than even Elizabeth never stayed more than a night in one house. She just kept on the move, eating people out of house and home. I mean, she might stay more than one night, but she kept on the move, eat them out of house and home. Literally, it comes from that time. Elizabeth, if you were blessed with a visit from the monarch, you could expect to be on your uppers. By the time her and her court left, she just couldn't afford to feed herself because all the money was going on ships. So James comes in, and it's significant. The first thing he does is to make the most significant law he could pass to make the country, he open up trade and to increase tolerance, but also to ignite ideas and new art forms, was to give people the freedom to express themselves through what they wore. So we have merchants, the Venetian ambassador, trade envoy wrote in 1625 that he estimated 25% of Londoners were cross-dressing, and that was his estimate that he gave.
And incredible, and so it seems like in terms of looking at this particular period, you had Elizabeth, and then things changed drastically under James, and then
I went off on a tangent.
That's okay.
It's such an exciting period.
You know so much, as I've never had to ask so little questions in 40 minutes.
I'm really sorry. You can tell that I've been bedbound since the 7th of October.
But we've already gone through an incredible kind of list of incredible figures.
Eccentric is an ancient Greek word, and it came to life in the crucible of the scientific revolution. Largely due to Francis Bacon and the court of James as well. Just think of, if you like to think of Wilton House, the Wilton Circle as it was known, the salon, which was a continuous occasion that went on for most of the year. The king came down to London for a very sort of quiet, private coronation, and then slipped back quickly to Wilton House. He signed a couple of documents in Hampton Court, but he went back to Wilton House. This salon continued. He saw As You Like It, fell in love with Shakespeare, and made him, well, let me just answer eccentric, I never will. So the word eccentric, it was vital to the scientific revolution because we had telescopes were improving every day on day. They're improving in quality. More and more people were able to afford to own a telescope or a microscope or both in their home. Certainly anyone with a scientific bent did. And the word eccentric is the term, eccentricity is the measurement of a planet's deviation from a perfectly circular orbit. And so it was used to describe a person's deviation from female woman, masculine man. So, or other sort of, no, really just that, because that covered everything else. So eccentricity was another one of these double entendre words. It could mean a measurement of a planet's deviation, or it could mean a person's deviation from a strictly masculine male or feminine woman position. And the eccentrics I often use as a term to describe the LGBTQ salons. They were, as I said, headed by defiant women who were usually queer, not always, although sometimes it's difficult to gauge. Sometimes through their love letters, where they get physical, explicitly physical, it's clear. So when James, it was electrifying for him to see this performance in which Frith performed the role of Touchstone. He was Shakespeare's muse. Now, they all knew one another in the theatrical world. Shakespeare had served time in prison because he and his confederates had armed with all manner of weaponry, had gone to, I'm quoting from the court records of Newgate Court, and they had gone to the Swan Theatre and taken it apart because theatre was banned, and the Swan Inn was a famous inn on Bankside, and the license he couldn't afford. It was a good income. He was a wealthy man thanks to it. Couldn't afford to risk losing his license or being prosecuted and imprisoned, whatever the punishment would be. As I said, these things vary greatly. We have very few court records, which is wonderful because we do have records of the religious courts, which is where we see Frith popping up all the time. As I said, there's more written about Frith than Shakespeare. A lot of things I've learned about Shakespeare came through my investigations into, I backdoor it by searching for archives of Frith. I've been contacted by museums in Suriname, in South America, who have information on Frith. It's extraordinary. But yes, he served a prison sentence because it was his idea, let's go and take apart the Swan Theatre and create the Globe with his confederates. And they took it apart. So they're armed with all manner of weapons, were essentially things to pull the wood planks off the building, and nails and hammers, bills, to not to harm people, but to simply dismantle the building and re-erect it further down the river. And these boatmen that carried them across meant that they'd carry a couple of chaps or chapesses in the boat, and then they would inevitably meet. So everyone met on their road to Bankside. Bankside was in the Liberties. These are the areas outside of London, the city of London, where theatres continued to prosper illegally, albeit how legally. The Puritans wrote of the Liberties as terribly dangerous and populated by footpads and prostitutes. Simply not true. It's just ordinary area, in like any part of London. Probably the city of London was far more dangerous, but this is where the theatres continued. And so Frith appeared in front of the king, Shakespeare's play As You Like It, and he was so overwhelmed. He had a love of theatre, which the Queen knew, well, Cecil's knew, and used to spy on him. They sent the Queen's own troupe up, not that she had anything to do with it. And Shakespeare was not amongst its number. Now, Shakespeare still had looks, apparently, then. When we think of Shakespeare, we think of as he appears in the engravings and the paintings of who we believe to be Shakespeare, the person known as Shakespeare. But in fact, from the point that he had any fame, 1603, he was wearing livery because King James thought, I like the look of this chap, and he liked him a lot. So he made all playwrights and players, he made them grooms of the royal chambers. Now, this meant that they were gentlemen of the royal court. It meant anywhere that the court was stationed, whatever palace or house they were in, these grooms, gentlemen, were entitled to enter. But Shakespeare, he made an extraordinary groom of the royal chambers, and that gave Shakespeare access to the king's bedroom, the sanctum sanctorum of where all the fun was had, and where they didn't know which way up the bed was by the end of the night. And so Shakespeare, as part of his reward, received 40 quid a year and 4 meters of scarlet cloth, velvet, and gold frocking, the same amount of frogging, to have livery made up. So we think of this fellow looking out at us often with the pearl earring around, given by his lover, William Herbert, the son, important to note, of Mary Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, of Wilton House, the saloniere. Her son, William, is when we read those racy poems that are very saucy indeed, the sonnets, 2/3 of them are dedicated to W.H., who is believed to be William Herbert, his lover. Now, this is referenced in numerous archives, and I don't think that anybody can genuinely think that it's anybody else. Although the Victorians had a damn good go at it.
Yes, this is something I wanted to ask you about, because this is certainly not the William Shakespeare many of us will be super familiar with from our English classes at school, from GCSE English Lit, or whenever we did that. And so, yeah, I mean, so what happened? Why is it that so many of these figures were completely destroyed, or they were, I suppose, just made to be so bland? When did that happen? Exactly, that's the perfect word.
It was really academic conversion therapy, if you think of it that way. So in most instances, LGBTQ torchbearers of history have been maligned or mostly ghosted. So I'll talk about a celebrity of the age, Mary Roth, the first woman to ever write a full-length piece of prose fiction. People say, who? She was a household name, not just in Britain. Mal Frith was an international household name. Mal Frith was famous in Africa, in Asia, not just Europe and Britain. These people were huge. Where are they? Just ghosted. It's like when you walk into St. James. This had a huge impact on me. I've been into many, many churches, but it happened in the St. James's Church that I had my epiphany. There were all these plaques over the walls and on the floors from the 1600s, from the Restoration. Elizabeth, the church, I thought it was designed by Elizabeth Wilbraham, who was the actual architect of 3/4 of the buildings that she was a trained architect, as opposed to Christopher Wren, who was just a builder. He was an engineer. He was her site manager. He was not an architect, as the buildings he did design bear testament. If you look at the spire on St. Bride's Church, it's rather drunk. And he only appears because she met him, and because he said it was impossible indeed to build St. Paul's Church because it was just mad. This is going to fall in. It's mathematically unsound, you stupid woman. I don't know that he said stupid woman, but I'm pretty certain he was thinking it. So that's just me adding my own little slant to it, but something inside me makes me believe it to be true. But so she agreed to meet with him. So Lady Wilbraham met with this little oik, and she mathematically explained to him in simple terms, womansplained to him the mathematics of how this Palladium building of such beauty would in fact not fall in. And he is said to have fallen at the hem of her skirts, which I find so upsetting as a woman when men do that. Get all the they spoil the line of everything, and she never met him again. But she did. You can see traces of earlier architectural designs that she's done. She's rubbed out the architect she had, some old fossil that she'd previously ascribed it to, and wrote Christopher Wren over the top of it. So she did make sure that everything, she decided to make him the person who would carry out, demanded her sister destroy everything. But there, in the last 30 years, a scholar, John Miller, he is British, but he's moved to America, has been, I think for 50 years now, he's been working on the project about Elizabeth Wilbraham. But certainly they're the things that I can find out about her. But where I was, what was I talking about? Ghosting of LGBTQ figures of history. They are mostly ghosted. So I say the names of huge celebrities and people say, oh, I've never heard of them. And I'm like, how can you not have heard of this person? And as I said, probably the first celebrity, and, you know, we think of the Kardashians as the first celebrities for doing nothing, just because their personalities, they've created this phenomena where no one can understand how it happened, because in a way they're so bland, but that's why. And they're so extraordinary in ways that everybody can't. I mean, I've not watched their show, but I know
you're not missing much. It's okay.
I've seen their photographs and I know what they look like. I know who they are. And why do I know any of this? For the same reason that everyone in the world knew who Mal Frith was, because he was extraordinary. He was a true eccentric. He was very funny. He strode the stage. There were over 7 plays written to him that are registered. We only have The Roaring Girl, which the Shakespeare Company, used to be attributed to Shakespeare. It was, and it was written, in fact, by Decker and gone blank. Anyway, it was written by a couple of other playwrights of city comedies, as they were known. But it was, until 1967, it was attributed to Shakespeare. And it was called The Roaring Girl, and it talked about this phenomena of women and men cross-dressing and how the Puritans tried to say that they were criminals. In fact, Mal Frith, far from being a criminal, worked for the king and probably signed up by Francis Bacon to stand in the court for aristocrats to give evidence, king's evidence it was called. He would say who stole someone's purse or who did something naughty. He knew what was going. He had an ear to the ground. Every little street urchin in London. He was sort of Sherlock Holmes of the 1600s, but he was Shakespeare's muse because he was just such a character, and he defied all the sort of the status quo, and he was not ashamed of the fact that he was born a woman and had changed his gender to male.
So just give us a little overview of what kind of happened at the end of the Victorian era and why it was that lots of these figures were kind of eradicated.
Okay, first off, my ancestor Daniel O'Connell was the first. He pushed through the Slavery Act. He was the first person to say that black people were he said that all brains are the same color and all hearts are the same gender. And he believed in emancipation of women, emancipation of all races. He did not believe, as Wilberforce and others had, that, well, they may be subhuman or less than us Anglo-Saxons, the superior race, but we as Christians should not treat anybody so poorly, enslave anybody. And this was the argument. And Daniel O'Connell, who was quite close to Garrison and Harrison, he said, no, they're fully human and as intelligent or more intelligent, they are just like us, that their skin color is irrelevant to anything, any any reason as to why they should be slaves or not slaves. They are humans in the fullest sense of the word. And this angered people so much. They believed it was a threat to the empire, to Christianity, to the chain of being, as I said, this important theme, to Anglo-Saxonism, this text that Cromwell, what was written by John Hare, but the historiography, as I said, Balzac said that history is written by privileged liars. That was really got started in the 1700s, but the real revisionist rewriting of history in a very grand way. Gibbons had heteronormalized Roman history. He'd exposed, the deviance of trans and gay figures in their pantheon of gods and goddesses, and also in their emperors and their poets. But he used this pamphlet I spoke of, Anglo-Saxonism, and he also used the Great Chain of Being. Anglo-Saxonism was a pamphlet published in 1647, and it had gone out of print, and it was re-invoked by Sir Thomas Carlyle and others who felt that, in the words of Thomas Carlyle, his history is I've forgotten the quote. It's a really common quote. Everybody in this room knows it, I'm sure. History is made by great men. And the fact that those great men were straight and white was very important to him, because he became a historian because of the abolition of slavery. He wrote so many controversial pamphlets, ranting, racist pamphlets of such awful diatribe that I don't want to tell you their names, because you might go and look them up and be horrified and think, how can these have been written? And in fact, pretty much most people in Britain felt the same. They were appalled by these essays he wrote, which were shocking at the time and controversial at the time, but they went down a treat in America as a justification for slavery. And so he lost his place in philosophy as the great sage of Chelsea. He lost his standing. No one would publish his works. No one would listen to him. He was sidelined. He was ostracized as a bigot, which he was. So he shut himself away, or made money out of America, and rewrote history as as a sort of a tribute, if you like, to Anglo-Saxon straight men. And he was prepared to change dates, facts, rub people out, certainly, I mean the term in literally, like erase them completely from history. And by taking out key figures, things crumble. It's like if you created a child creates a Lego castle, and you take away a couple of key blocks, you can make the whole edifice come tumbling down. And this is what happened to history. It doesn't work when you take out the key figures, nor does it work when they're not true to the people they were. It changes the complexion of everything once you know that Shakespeare was gay, that Francis Bacon was gay, that James was gay. And I mean, we only know they're gay because because the famous court case of Francis Bacon endured. There's much written about him and enough archival evidence to prove it, but also his nemesis since bar school days, they were barristers together, his great nemesis, Edward Coke, he blackmailed him and said, I have people, because he was a very powerful person. He was a member of the aristocracy. He had the ear of the king. He was second in command to the king. He was a parliamentarian. There was no one more senior. And he was the intimate friends with James and his lover, his wife, not just his lover, his wife. They had been married in their own ceremony after the death of his queen, Anna, who had given them the relationship her blessing. And he was originally buried with Esme Stuart's heart, and with when George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, died, he was buried alongside him. Now, their bodies were dug up by Cromwell and disappeared until the Victorian age, but that's another long story. But you can find them in the Ladies' Chapel, of all places, in Westminster Abbey. But so once you change with this historiography of, and I was saying that it was very important that these people were straight. One of the battles that he had with his competitor, Babington Macaulay, was they both wrote biographies of Frederick. I always want to call him something else. Frederick the Great. Now, Babington had written his own book stating that he couldn't be considered a great figure of history, great man of history, because he was gay. And that discounted him. Well, Thomas Carlyle came out swinging and saying, no, that's just terrible lies and calumnies spread by his enemies. In fact, he was straighter than straight. He was a real trusty man, which sounds gayer than anything, doesn't it? But that is what he said. He argued this mad argument, which anyone who's read anything about Frederick knows. He was openly gay. He was as gay as Alexander the Great. I mean, no one could be gayer than he was. He didn't have any shame in it. And I'm not saying that he should, but they clearly thought this is an important issue. You can't be a great man of history if you're gay. And that is just adds to the sort of madness of this whole Victorian eruption of bigotry that happened after they abolished slavery. They went nuts on this. They became Puritans. They became puritanical in this tirade. On to qualify to be a great man of history, you had to be straight. And they went on. He wrote tracts. They all did. Wrote tracts about moral deviancies and the supreme chain of being. They loved that. They loved that, and they loved Anglo-Saxonism as an argument for the superiority of straight Anglo-Saxon. Not you couldn't be Mediterranean or Celtish. That's just taints the blood. He was the first self-proclaimed, as far as I can find, he's the first person to self-proclaimed white supremacist. Now we see that as an insult. That was his badge of pride, and it took off like a treat in America too. And well, as I said, they just worshipped the ground he walked on. It makes me cringe often when Waldo Emerson loved him. Some of the times I hear Americans quote these people, I think you do know that these people you're quoting, American heroes you're quoting, were close friends of and brothers in thinking, in thought, and in brothers in bigotry was Waldo Emerson and Mark Twain. And it's just upsetting, really. And I think they said enough probably to just sort of wriggle their way into liberal as much as they were drawing rooms of America at the time. Remember, America was much more bigoted during the Victorian era even than Britain. Britain was really trying to loosen up a bit. I mean, the Abolition of Slavery Act had come too late, and it was only stalled. We had 30 MPs whose sole platform was the abolition of slavery in 1774. So it just shows it was a topic on people's mind. It was something being discussed in drawing rooms, in the salons rather, in the circles, the Savile Circle, and the Elizabeth Wilbraham Circle, another famous LGB salon that was hosted in Portman Square, Home House, opposite Home House, what is now that awful hotel, Churchill something hotel, aptly named. But that was the just in terms of it's very unattractive and brutalist looking, but it was that was a very famous salon in the latter part of the 1800s. So all the figures that went there were the figures that Carlyle and the white supremacists railed against, not just because they were LGBTQ, but they believed in the votes for women. They were suffragettes, as they later called them. They were abolitionists. They had all these liberal ideas, But the fact is that people did know they were LGBTQ. They were seen as eccentrics, and that covered a multitude of pleasures.
Incredible, and an unbelievable group of incredible individuals. I'm sure many of us will be going home and doing our own research about this, because there's so much to uncover and so much that we may not know. I have to say that went by so unbelievably quickly. We're kind of pretty much out of time.
Source archives and cross-reference, because if you read anything written in the 1600s and the 1700s or 1800s, you are reading historiography, not historiocracy. There's a big debate going on now as to whether we should rely on source archives or interpreted, because at the moment we just rely on an agreed narrative. We're all going to agree that Shakespeare looked like this. We're all going to agree that Frith was a criminal. We're all going to agree that Francis Bacon is the father of empirical thinking. We're all going to agree that he took bribes, and he didn't.
Indeed.
That was what he went down. That's what he was punished for. He was sent to life imprisonment in the Tower and fined £5,000, which he didn't possess. And the king took care of it, but he wasn't allowed to go within 5 miles of the king or the Duke of Buckingham.
Goodness me. But certainly your own website and your own social media is a really fantastic place where if anyone wants to kind of learn more about lots of these incredible figures, you certainly can. You have a wealth of information online, which is absolutely fantastic. We probably will have time for 1 or 2 questions if anybody has any of those, because I mean, I know we covered a huge amount, and it was absolutely incredible.
For that.
No, oh my goodness, please don't. I've had an incredibly easy job. I was like, oh my goodness, I need to check the time and make sure that we're kind of staying on track. But if anybody has any questions at home as well, you can definitely ask questions as well. I really don't believe that not a single person has a question. So yes, we'll go Nicolette. Yes, of course. I think,
Please
do we have to?
Question me, Nicolette.
Yes, go for it.
I love your glasses. It's so...
There we are. In history, I'm not quite sure that LGBTQ existed.
No, it didn't. So the word transgender came about in 86. The word queer has been kicking around for a good while, like eccentric. It was sort of a coverall word for lesbians there was just derogatory terms, and or sappist, which is a lovely term, I think. But yes, they didn't. The word homosexual is a Victorian term. They were just referred to as sodomites, catamites. It didn't mean pederasts, by the way. They called gay people. Called gay, often referred to in history. You'll read about someone who's not a catamite, a pederast. That did not necessarily mean, and often didn't, that it might just mean gay. What we would refer to as gay had nothing to do with the fact that they were after young boys, nothing illegal or unpleasant. It was just a word that was associated with male intimacy.
Yeah. So here's my question. In history, did we have a kind of divide between homosexuality and cross-dressing? Because it was quite still now. I mean, we put them all together, although it is not really, the same thing.
No. I mean,
how were they seen? How did they fit in with one another? Because one thing is being a cross-dresser, one thing is being transgender, and one thing is to be gay.
Correct. That's right.
So what was the case in history?
That's a really excellent question, because we did create these labels rather recently, very recently, compared to history. Well, I think that's
what is
Not always, but often often the issues align together.
Yeah.
So we can join together on issues. It's like women. We have feminism and we may disagree on certain issues, but we as LGBTQ community, we may feel align on many issues. So at the moment there seems to be everyone, but then there's the LGB Alliance, which many of you will have heard of, which is unpleasant. They are anti-trans. And as a woman, I mean, if you ask in terms of how did they, were they all seen together, the first law, as I said, about homosexuality came about in 15 with the Reformation. Transgenderism, the law came and then was taken away and then was put back again by Cromwell in 42. But within the period, the first 100 years, homosexuality, although it was legislated against, there was less than a dozen convictions. But it was used, as in the case of Francis Bacon, as a means of blackmailing people. So whether people were gay or not, it was used to blackmail. So it was a very dangerous law, because how did you prove someone was gay unless you caught them in the act? So they would just have a member of their household might be prepared to speak against them and calumnies against them just for some payment. But they did, as I said, the circles, the salons, they did congregate together. They did have that was the closest, I would say, to an LGBTQ atmosphere. Looking at modern figures in Britain alone, I speak, for young people under 30 who identify as LGBTQIA, the figure has risen exponentially in the last 10 years even, as to an increase in how many people identify as not strictly straight. So it has changed. And I don't know if that's because people feel more acceptable. Ireland, a Catholic country, as a historian, I find it fascinating that they voted, when they voted abortion, because they were also asked another series of questions as well as their vote, which was, do you identify as Catholic? Would you have an abortion yourself? So they voted pro-abortion, majority, but they still identified as Catholic and said, no, I wouldn't have an abortion myself, but they didn't believe it should be legislated against. And this is one of the things I think that happens with LGBTQ. We're just becoming more open about having our own opinion on things. We won't be told what to think by a religious group or even the LGBT community squabble within one another. It's not really a mass of people. They're all jammed together, these bunch of alphabet letters, but it's a letter soup, really. It's meaningless. It's like the word feminism. I mean, so many women say to me, it's not that I'm a feminist. And I think they are a feminist. I don't think there's a woman alive who cannot call herself a feminist unless she wants to say, I'm a submissive woman who wants all my own ideas taken out of my head and my own agency taken from me. I think, but these terms are very difficult to understand sometimes. And I think it's, in a way, I think looking back, people were just much more tolerant of difference because life was harder. That's one of the reasons I've come up with, because just even for the rich, illness, the struggle of getting anything done, everything was harder than it is now. Everything we want, we can get quite easily. And I think that things were harder then to achieve anything, to order a pair of shoes and to get all the right ingredients for a recipe, all these things. Everything was harder. We didn't have the same luxury of immediacy that we have. So people were more tolerant. They had to be, because they relied on one another for everything. There was no law force, there was no medical group, so people helped one another out in every area of society, whatever class you were. So you didn't want to fall out with someone because you thought, well, they're a cross-dresser, and I mean, unless you're a Puritan.
Thank you. Gosh, that was a fantastic answer and a fantastic question. I think
Did I
probably
answer your...
Yeah.
It is not straightforward.
Certainly not.
It's not a straightforward answer.
Absolutely.
Yes, it is.
One thing
Indeed.
I would say, just reading on Mal Frith, and this is important for all women, is that Mal Frith was called the champion of women by Puritans and later historians, the champion of women. And this was because he led, he had LGBTQ, he gathered them together because they were all illegal. They were all being arrested, and they clogged the streets up, and they'd cross-dress, but not cross-dress in the sense that a man would dress as a woman, but a man would dress as half man, half woman. And women would dress as half man, half woman, and they would be a mixture of everything. Ooh, what am I? Ooh, it's confusing, isn't it? And they'd smoke pipes so that create this fog of smoke, so that the army, the new model army, the Puritan army, which rode on horses around the small narrow streets of London, often alleyways of the city of London, and they would clog the streets up. And he was even called the great parliamentarian, Mal Frith. So that's incredible. But cross-dressing was very popular. 25% of Londoners were doing it. And I think it was a way of expressing oneself as well as expressing one's gender.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not sure if we do have time for another question. We are quite over time, so I think we should probably end it there. But if you do have a question, I'm sure Tyne will answer a couple more afterwards, perhaps, if you come and say hello. Hundreds of years we just sped through.
LGBT
absolutely.
Torchbearers.
And it has been absolutely fantastic. Can we please give Tyne a huge round of applause?
I'll give you a bow.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm sorry, I probably just babbled
Absolutely
away.
not. It's been absolutely fantastic. If anyone was taking notes, oh my goodness, so you'll have an awful lot to cover when you get home. Absolutely. And thank you to you all for joining us this evening, and we hope you have a lovely rest of your night. And I'm sure if anyone has any specific questions, Tyne would happily maybe stick around for 5 minutes and answer those. But thank you so much for joining us, and have a fantastic evening.